Today, this committee convenes for a hearing on monetary policy and the state of the economy. Chairman Powell, welcome back. Today, I'd like to start by addressing the current elephant in the room when it comes to monetary policy and the Fed. This president has made it clear that he has no understanding or respect for the independence of the Federal Reserve. He has said the Fed, quote, doesn't have a clue, quote, unquote, and called it the most difficult problem for the U.S. According to media reports, he has discussed firing Chairman Powell, just as he has fired others he does not agree with. Let's be clear. It is essential that the Federal Reserve maintain its independence from the executive branch. And so, I urge Chairman Powell and other Federal Reserve Board governors not to submit to the high-pressure tactics of this president, who continues to push reckless and harmful economic and social policies. Another issue I hope Chairman Powell will address today is Facebook's recently announced plan, along with 27 other companies, to develop a cryptocurrency and digital wallet. I and other Democrats on the committee have raised concerns that Facebook's planned products may ultimately be intended to establish a parallel banking and monetary policy system to rival the dollar. In a letter last week, we asked Facebook to agree to a moratorium on any movement forward on its plans to create a cryptocurrency or digital wallet. I believe that Facebook is planning what they're planning raises serious privacy, trading, national security, and monetary policy concerns for consumers, investors, the U.S. economy, and the global economy. But Facebook's foray into this field should signal to all of us that our current system of regulation lacks adequate coordination, safeguards, and attention to cryptocurrency. Chairman Powell, the Fed should be a leader on this issue and should not take a wait-and-see approach when it comes to examining a financial system involving 2.4 billion people. So I look forward to hearing your views on Facebook's plans to create a cryptocurrency today. Another issue I would like to discuss is bank deregulation. I remain concerned about the Federal Reserve's actions to weaken safeguards that Congress and Chairman Powell's predecessors put in place following the financial crisis. Specifically, it appears that the Fed may be following the Trump administration's deregulatory plan to weaken the capital and liquidity buffers of some of the largest banks. As I've said before, I believe this to be ill-advised, particularly when many economists, including economists at the Federal Reserve, believe that current bank capital levels are on the low end of what would be necessary to withstand another financial crisis. I look forward to your testimony and to discussing these matters with you today. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairwoman for yielding. I'd like to, as well, welcome Chairman Powell back to the committee. Chairman Powell has prioritized outreach to Congress, and members of this body have benefited greatly from hearing his thoughts in February and in individual meetings since then. So we thank you for your return. I know the markets are interested in your testimony, but we as policymakers, too, are interested in your testimony. As I stated at our hearing in February, the economy over the last 2.5 years has witnessed remarkable growth, and unemployment has reached lows that many believe were impossible. Republican-led tax relief and regulatory reform have supported these trends, with millions of Americans benefiting from our policies. We're seeing this in wage growth. We're seeing this in continued job growth. All Americans are benefiting from this. These benefits continue to endure 5 months since your last testimony. And in the most recent FOMC statement, the Fed concluded that the labor markets remain strong and that economic activity is rising. Job gains have been solid and the unemployment rate remains low. But we cannot take our foot off the pedal. In February, we discussed how the Fed was undertaking targeted rulemaking to provide regulatory relief that allows financial institutions to operate efficiently in the communities that they serve and compete globally as well. I hope that you, Chairman Powell, will continue to work to undertake these efforts with a sense of urgency, especially in the rulemaking category. I also encourage Chairman Powell to maintain his commitment to transparency and proactive communication with Capitol Hill, especially when the Fed is considering changes to its policies and operations. At our last hearing, for instance, the chairman noted that the Fed continues to support its current inflation target. But as we know, there are numerous proposals that would affect how the Fed might pursue that target. I hope that the Fed will approach such proposals with an appropriate level of prudence, given the limitations of central banks' toolkits at this point in our economic cycle, until we fully understand how those limitations have emerged and how they can reliably be overcome. So finally, let me reiterate my concerns shared by the Fed itself, that global economic uncertainty could result in headwinds here at home. Prior to our February hearing, the Fed made clear that Europe and China represent the risks that the Fed would continue to monitor and, where appropriate, work to mitigate. I hope we can touch on those things today. Let me highlight China in particular. When the chairman last appeared before our committee, he noted that the Chinese economy is state-run, but that Beijing has also attempted to make certain market-oriented reforms. I'm concerned that these reforms may not be deep enough. When the world's second-largest economy is a one-party state without the rule of law, without transparent decision-making, where monetary policy and allocation of capital bends to politics and cronyism, where 1 million citizens can be locked up in camps, while another million take to the streets to defend their freedoms, then we all need to focus on that country and its regime as a unique source of risk to the global stability and global growth. So I would encourage the chairman to work with his colleagues, both here and abroad, so that we have a sufficient understanding of China, and as well as a sufficient set of tools within central banks if something were to go wrong. And again, thank you, Chairman Powell, for returning today. Thank you for your responsiveness. Your candor is welcome and encouraged. We thank you for attempting to speak like a normal human being, even amidst very complex financial markets and complex decision-making within our independent monetary policy group called the Federal Reserve. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the subcommittee chair, Mr. Cleaver, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're pleased to have you here again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. And I wanted to discuss the impact of this trade war, over 500 days in this trade war. But I can't hardly move there because the number one concern I'm having is that this administration is very publicly trying to force financial markets and the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates to offset what I think to be an irrational trade war and poor fiscal policies. And the issue for me is that in January I will have been on this committee for 15 years, and I have never seen a president meddle in the Federal Reserve as this president has, and it is deeply disturbing. And the problem is that it seems to be working because we're moving in the direction that he's been ordering, and hopefully you can address some of this when we get back into the question and answer period. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The chair now recognizes the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Stivers, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chair Powell, welcome back to the committee. Because of the tax cut and regulatory reforms, the U.S. has seen unprecedented economic growth, wage growth, as well as record low unemployment and stable prices. And since the last time you were here, we've seen a mostly steady economy with unemployment at 3.7% and consumer prices only edging up about 0.1%. But I've heard anecdotal evidence of slowing investment and price increases. I want to thank you for your steady hand on monetary policy. That's an important part of our economic success. And while acknowledging the recent success, I know the FMOC meetings have pointed to uncertainties in economic outlook, meaning that your data may be telling you the same thing that I've been hearing. I do agree with Chair Waters that I want to hear about your perspective on Facebook's cryptocurrency. I think they are attempting to undermine the dollar as the world's currency. I also am interested in hearing your views of where we are in the business cycle and what we can do to support you on fiscal and other policies. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome to the committee our distinguished witness, Jerome Powell, Chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. He has served on the Board of Governors since 2012 and as its chair since 2017. Mr. Powell has testified before this committee, and I believe he does not need any further introduction. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Mr. Powell, you are now recognized to present your oral testimony.
Thank you and good morning. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, I'm pleased to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report to Congress. Let me start by saying that my colleagues and I strongly support the goals of maximum employment and price stability that Congress has set for us for monetary policy. We are committed to providing clear explanations about our policies and activities. Congress has given us an important degree of independence so that we can effectively pursue our statutory goals based on objective analysis and data. We appreciate that our independence brings with it an obligation for transparency so that you and the public can hold us accountable. Today, I will review the current economic situation and outlook before turning to monetary policy. I will also provide an update on our ongoing public review of our framework for setting monetary policy. The economy performed reasonably well over the first half of 2019, and the current expansion is now in its 11th year. However, inflation has been running below the FOMC's symmetric 2% objective, and cross-currents, such as trade tensions and concerns about global growth, have been weighing on economic activity and the outlook. The labor market remains healthy. Job gains averaged 172,000 per month from January through June. This number is lower than the average of 223,000 jobs per month last year, but above the pace needed to provide jobs for new workers entering the labor force. Consequently, the unemployment rate moved down from 3.9% in December to 3.7% in June, close to its lowest level in 50 years. Job openings remain plentiful, and employers are increasingly willing to hire workers with fewer skills and train them. As a result, the benefits of a strong job market have been more widely shared in recent years. Indeed, wage gains have been higher for lower-skilled workers. That said, individuals in some demographic groups and in certain parts of the country continue to face challenges. For example, unemployment rates for African Americans and Hispanics remain well above the rates for whites and Asians. Likewise, the share of the population with a job is higher in urban areas than in rural communities, and this gap has widened over the past decade. A box in the July Monetary Policy Report provides a comparison of employment and wage gains over the current expansion for individuals with different levels of education. GDP increased at an annual rate of 3.1% in the first quarter of 2019, similar to last year's pace. This strong reading was driven largely by net exports and inventories, components that are not generally reliable indicators of ongoing momentum. The more reliable drivers of growth in the economy are consumer spending and business investment. While growth in consumer spending was weak in the first quarter, incoming data show that it has bounced back and is now running at a solid pace. However, growth in business investment seems to have slowed notably, and overall growth in the second quarter appears to have moderated. The slowdown in business fixed investment may reflect concerns about trade tensions and slower growth in the global economy. In addition, housing investment and manufacturing output declined in the first quarter and appear to have decreased again in the second quarter. After running close to our 2% objective over much of last year, overall consumer price inflation, measured by the 12-month change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures, or PCE inflation, declined earlier this year and stood at 1.5% in May. The 12-month change in core PCE inflation, which excludes food and energy prices and tends to be a better indicator of future inflation, has also come down this year and was 1.6% in May. Our baseline outlook is for economic growth to remain solid, labor markets to stay strong, and inflation to move back up over time to the committee's 2% objective. However, uncertainties about the outlook have increased in recent months. In particular, economic momentum appears to have slowed in some major foreign economies, and that weakness could affect the U.S. economy. Moreover, a number of government policy issues have yet to be resolved, including trade developments, the federal debt ceiling, and Brexit. And there is a risk that weak inflation will be even more persistent than we currently anticipate. We're carefully monitoring these developments and will continue to assess their implications for the U.S. economic outlook and inflation. The nation also continues to confront important longer-run challenges. Labor force participation by those in their prime working years is now lower in the United States than in most other nations with comparable economies. As I mentioned, there are troubling labor market disparities across demographic groups and different parts of the country. The relative stagnation of middle and lower incomes and low levels of upward mobility for low and lower income families are also ongoing concerns. In addition, finding ways to boost productivity growth, which leads to rising wages and living standards over the longer term, should remain a high national priority. And I remain concerned about the longer-term effects of high and rising federal debt, which can restrain private investment and in turn reduce productivity and overall economic growth. The longer-run vitality of the U.S. economy would benefit from efforts to address these issues. Against this backdrop, the FOMC maintained the target range for the federal funds rate at 2.25% to 2.5% in the first half of this year. At our January, March, and May meetings, we stated that we would be patient as we determined what future adjustments to the federal funds rate might be appropriate to support our goals of maximum employment and price stability. At the time of our May meeting, we were mindful of the ongoing cross-currents from global growth and trade, but there was tentative evidence that these cross-currents were moderating. The latest data from China and Europe were encouraging, and there were reports of progress in trade negotiations with China. Our continued patient stance seemed appropriate, and the committee saw no strong case for adjusting our policy rate. Since our May meeting, however, these cross-currents have reemerged, creating greater uncertainty. Apparent progress on trade turned to greater uncertainty, and our Contacts in Business and Agriculture report heightened concerns over trade developments. Growth indicators from around the world have disappointed on net, raising concerns that weakness in the global economy will continue to affect the U.S. economy. These concerns may have contributed to the drop in business confidence in some recent surveys and may have started to show through to incoming data. At our June meeting, we indicated that, in light of increased uncertainties about the economic outlook and muted inflation pressures, we would closely monitor the implications of incoming information for the economic outlook and would act as appropriate to sustain the expansion. Many FOMC participants saw that the case for a somewhat more accommodative monetary policy stance had strengthened. Since then, based on incoming data and other developments, it appears that uncertainties around trade tensions and concerns about the strength of the global economy continue to weigh on the U.S. economic outlook. Inflation pressures remain muted. The FOMC has made a number of important decisions this year about our framework for implementing monetary policy and our plans for completing the reduction of the Fed's securities holdings. At our January meeting, we decided to continue to implement monetary policy using our current policy regime with ample reserves and emphasize that we are prepared to adjust any of the details for completing balance sheet normalization in light of economic and financial developments. At our March meeting, we communicated our intention to slow, starting in May, the decline in the Fed's aggregate securities holdings and to end the reduction in these holdings in September. The July Monetary Policy Report provides details on these decisions. The report also includes an update on monetary policy rules. The FOMC routinely looks at monetary policy rules that recommend a level for the federal funds rate based on inflation and unemployment rates. I continue to find these rules helpful, although using these rules requires careful judgment. We are conducting a public review of our monetary policy strategy, tools, and communications, the first review of its kind for the FOMC. Our motivation is to consider ways to improve the committee's current policy framework and to best position the Fed to achieve maximum employment and price stability. The review has started with outreach to and consultation with a broad range of people and groups through a series of Fed Listens events. The FOMC will consider questions related to the review at upcoming meetings, and we will publicly report the outcome of our discussions. Thank you, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Powell. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. On June 18th, Facebook announced its plans to launch Libra, a new global cryptocurrency, as well as a new payment system, Calibra, which will facilitate Libra transactions. On June 24th, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chairman of Supervision, Randall Quarles, quote, a letter in his capacity as chairman of the Financial Stability Board to the G20 leaders, noting a wider use of new types of cryptocurrency, crypto assets for retail payment purposes would warrant close scrutiny by authorities to ensure that they are subject to high standards of regulation, end quote. Signaling that global regulatory coordination of Facebook will be a priority. Chairman Powell, did the Federal Reserve speak with Facebook about their Libra currency, and if so, were any concerns raised? Does the Federal Reserve have any authority to supervise and regulate what could be the world's largest payment system? Does the Federal Reserve have any concerns about monetary policy with regard to Libra?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We did actually have a meeting with representatives of Facebook a couple of months before the announcement. I think they made fairly broad set of visits to authorities around the world. But getting to your questions, let me start by saying that we do support responsible innovation in the financial services industry as long as the associated risks are appropriately identified and managed. And as we'll discuss, while the project sponsors hold out the possibility of public benefits, including improved financial access for consumers, Libra raises many serious concerns regarding privacy, money laundering, consumer protection, and financial stability. These are concerns that should be thoroughly and publicly addressed before proceeding. And that's why at the Fed we've set up a working group to focus on this set of issues. We are coordinating with our colleagues in the government in the United States, the regulatory agencies and Treasury. We're coordinating with central banks and governments around the world to look into this. And I'll just add that the process of addressing these concerns, we think, should be a patient and careful one and not a sprint to implementation.
So are you speaking of a working group within FSOC?
Well, the Fed we have our own working group. I believe FSOC has already got a working group at the staff level, or in effect has a working group at the staff level.
Well,
yes.
FSOC does have a cryptocurrency working group. Is FSOC or this working group reviewing the extensive policy questions and potential impact that Libra and Calibra have? Do you know what they're doing?
I do believe they are. I know there was a staff level meeting just last week to focus on Libra at FSOC, so all the agencies were there. So I think the answer to your question would be yes.
Do you think that FSOC will designate, or is FSOC considering designating the Libra Association and Calibra either as systemic financial market utilities or non-bank financial companies and subject them to enhanced regulatory oversight? Are you aware of that?
I think it's early to say. There hasn't been a principals meeting of FSOC since the Libra announcement. And while there have been conversations, I think it's highly likely that FSOC will be taking this on in a serious way, but that is in the hands of the Treasury Secretary who chairs FSOC.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, if you got a call from the President today or tomorrow, and he said, I'm firing you, pack up, it's time to go, what would you do?
Well, of course I would not do that.
I can't hear you.
My answer would be no.
And you would not pack up and you would not leave?
No, ma'am.
Because you think the President doesn't have the authority? Is that why you would not leave?
I've kind of said what I've intended to say on the subject, and what I've said is that the law clearly gives me a 4-year term, and I fully intend to serve it.
Okay, so I hope everybody heard that. With that, I will yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, the ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
So, Chairman Powell, in your testimony, you said you'll use macroeconomic data to inform your decision on whether lower interest rates are required at the end of the month or not. What specific data would likely lead to you recommending a change in rates?
Between now and the end of the month, there's data coming in on almost everything. You'll have labor market data, you'll have second quarter GDP, you'll have retail sales, you'll have a broad range of data coming over the next 3 weeks, and we'll be looking at all of that. I wouldn't point to any one data point or even any period. We try to look over longer periods of time and assess what's really going on a more fundamental level, and that's what we'll do as we evaluate the incoming data.
And there is also an understanding of the market assumption of what the Federal Reserve Open Markets Committee will do as well. Is there not?
There is. We look at a broad range of financial conditions. We don't focus on any one thing, but our policy works through financial conditions, and so we'll look at a broad range of things in the financial markets.
So a broad range of things, macroeconomic data. Emotion?
Emotion? Not on our part. We'll try to be very rational and analytical and transparent about how we're thinking about these things.
So along the lines of that transparency, the velocity of the economy you speak to, and the larger global macroeconomic issues that are at play here as well. So along those lines, is the Federal Reserve, does the Federal Reserve have the capacity to make independent monetary policy decisions under law?
Yes, we do.
Is that impeded by people saying negative things about you?
We will.
Is that enhanced or diminished based off people saying positive or negative things about you?
Neither. We will always focus on doing the job you have assigned us, and we will always do it to the best of our ability and based on objective analysis and facts.
So along those lines, we have a significant change to LIBOR policy. And I wrote to Vice Chair Quarles along those lines. The Fed has spoken publicly about this as well, that there's been major progress made in terms of the swaps and derivatives contracts. I remain concerned about legacy retail contracts as well. Has the Fed undertaken analysis along those lines about legacy retail contracts and the use of LIBOR?
Yes, indeed we have. And that's a very important part of the project going forward. So we've reached out to representatives of retail users of LIBOR for some time now and are meeting with them regularly and developing plans to deal with that because, as you know, as you pointed out in your letter, a significant quantity of the LIBOR contracts are, in fact, mortgages and the like. So that's a really important area. We did the derivative things first because they were close to hand and quite large, but we're working hard on the retail side now.
So is there any estimate on the number of loans that would have to be renegotiated because of this policy change?
I don't have a number for you. I mean,
okay. So I also want to touch on Project Libra. You mentioned and answered a number of those questions. It looked like you're quite prepared for that. You mentioned financial stability as a concern. Why? Why is Project Libra a question of financial stability in your view?
Well, really due to the possibility of quite broad adoption. Facebook has a couple billion plus users, so you have, I think, for the first time, the possibility of a very broad adoption. And if there were problems there associated with money laundering, terrorist financing, any of the things that we're all focused on, including the company, they would immediately, they would arise to systemically important levels just because of the mere size of the Facebook network. And the company has said so explicitly.
Is it a problem that we don't have a regulatory regime that's permissive of these technologies to be developed here in the United States?
I don't know that that's a problem. That's a question of whether we're impeding blockchain. I don't believe so, but I don't know the answer to that.
But there is an opportunity here for financial inclusion benefits and innovation benefits if this worked well. Is there not?
There is that possibility, and as I mentioned, that is the main benefit the company is holding out. And I also mentioned that we are open to financial innovation. We just want it to take place in a safe and sound way.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you for your service, Chairman. Chairman, in June, the Fed decided not to cut interest rates and to take a wait-and-see approach instead. In your press conference, you said this approach was justified because, and I quote, "We will see a lot more on all of these issues in the very near term," end quote. Last week we got the job numbers for June, and they were very strong, with the employers adding 224,000 jobs. So my question is, did the June jobs report change your outlook for whether a reduction in interest rates is appropriate in the near term?
Well, a straight answer to your question is no, but I will give you the context. We look at a broad range of data. So let's start abroad, where I think since the June meeting and for a period before that, the data have continued to disappoint. And that's very broad across Europe and around Asia, and that continues to weigh. And by the way, manufacturing, trade, and investment are weak all around the world. We have a box that talks about that in the monetary policy report. In the United States, we did get a job report that was positive, and that's great news. And we had some other reasonably good news. I would say the U.S. data came in about as expected. And I would also say that let's go to trade. We've agreed to begin discussions again with China, and while that's a constructive step, it doesn't remove the uncertainty that we see as overall weighing on the outlook. So I would say that the bottom line for me is that the uncertainties around global growth and trade continue to weigh on the outlook. In addition, inflation continues to be muted, and those things are still in place.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, some economists and many market participants believe that the Fed should cut interest rates by a full 50 basis points in July, rather than a normal cut of 25 basis points. Personally, I don't see the case for cutting rates by 50 basis points because the economy is quite strong right now. What economic factors do you believe would justify taking the unusual step of cutting rates by a full 50 basis points?
At our meeting, which is in 3 weeks, we'll be looking at a full range of data. And I would just take you through the story I just told you. That'll be what we're thinking about, is the extent to which trade developments and concerns over global growth are weighing on the outlook, and also the performance of inflation. Those are the factors that we've identified, and all of that will go into our decision making.
And also, Mr. Chairman, you have repeatedly stressed that uncertainty about trade policy is a major economic headwind and is one of the factors that could lead the Fed to cut rates this month. But as we've seen under the President's, very unlikely that we'll ever get much certainty on trade policy. It keeps changing every day. So my question is, what kind of progress in trade negotiations do you need to see in order to put your mind at ease about trade developments not being a headwind, to use your term, to economic growth?
I guess I ought to start by saying that no one should interpret what I'm saying about trade headwinds as in any way a criticism of trade policy. We do not play a role in assessing or criticizing or trade policy. It's not something that's assigned to us. We react to anything that, in principle, anything that can affect our ability to achieve the dual mandate goals you've assigned us is something that could, in principle, call for a policy response. Right now, that is global headwind, global weakness, and trade developments are things that are widely thought to have that effect. That's all. So I wouldn't want to try to prescribe a specific answer, and again, it wouldn't be ours to do in the first place.
Well, hopefully we'll have some answers on trade soon, and thank you for your service, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here today to testify. Chairman Powell, Vice Chairman Quarles just yesterday indicated the Federal Reserve would revise its stress capital buffer proposal in the near future. Vice Chairman Quarles indicated one option would be to look at an average of stress test results over a number of years. Are you in agreement with Vice Chairman Quarles that this is something that needs to be considered, and what factors might necessitate this change, sir?
So we are in the process of evaluating, I think in the late stages of evaluating how to put into effect the stress capital buffer, which merges the results of the stress tests with the underlying overall capital framework. It's a complicated exercise. There are many moving pieces. That's one of them. I wouldn't want to single any single one out as important for our consideration, but that's
so
one of
the
them.
So the average, taking an average of stress test results over a number of years is something that's under consideration, but is maybe a change that you're not necessitating just yet, or?
We're very much in the process of evaluating all of those ideas, and I wouldn't want to single that one out as either in or out. Just there are many pieces, but yes, that is one of the pieces.
Mr. Chairman, you said you're in the late stages. What's your time frame, do you believe, for coming up with an option in terms of the stress capital buffer proposal?
I'd have to come back to you with a date, but it would be within soon, in the near future.
Thank you. Chairman Powell, at your January press conference, you were asked whether a $4 trillion balance sheet gave you sufficient firepower to handle a future recession, and you answered yes. However, the Fed's balance sheet as a share of GDP is about where the Bank of Japan balance sheet was prior to the financial crisis. Today, the Bank of Japan has ended up with a balance sheet as large as the Japanese economy, with mixed results on inflation and limited room to handle another downturn. Has Japan's experience, sir, affected your thinking on the appropriate size of the Fed's balance sheet?
I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the experience of Japan really over the last quarter century, and all of us have looked very careful at that.
And to that point, if I may, why should we feel certain that the U.S. could avoid a similar fate? And perhaps you could elaborate.
What Japan has found itself in a situation where inflation has gotten down close to zero for a very long time, and they've tried many, many things, including, as you mentioned, extensive asset purchases and all sorts of forward guidance to move inflation back up, and have not met with much success, although they continue to struggle to do that. So my main takeaway from that, and by the way, the European Central Bank is fighting that battle
Yes.
as well. My main takeaway from that, honestly, is that the Fed needs to stand here and try to keep inflation symmetrically at 2%. We don't want to get on that road of declining it. To the extent inflation continues to decline and expectations decline, that will show up in lower interest rates, which will give the central bank even less firepower to react. And we see that road is hard to get off of. So I think it's quite important that we fight at 2% to keep inflation up to 2% and use our tools to achieve that symmetrically, and we're strongly committed to doing that.
The most recent monetary policy report stated, and I quote, "Consumer spending in the first quarter was lackluster but appears to have picked up." And you talked a little bit about this in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman. Can you please explain the possible variables behind lackluster consumer spending and why the recent turnaround?
Well, I think the consumer part of the economy is 70% of the economy, and it's healthy, it's strong, it's good job creation, it's rising wages. Workers' surveys show that they think jobs are plentiful. Business surveys show that they think workers are scarce. So this is a good place for the consumer part of the economy, and you see that in surveys, you see it in consumer spending and things like that.
The concerns about workforce development and having enough able workforce is very key. You're right.
They are, but I think a tight labor force is lifting all sorts of communities
Yep.
into the labor force, and it's good. The issue really is more now on the business side, where we see business confidence and business investment weakening a bit.
I thank you. I've run out of time. I yield back to the chair. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Clay, the gentleman from Missouri is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for your visit today. In his blog published Just yesterday, the St. Louis Federal Reserve noted that a rise in uncertainty is widely believed to have detrimental effects on macroeconomic, microeconomic, and financial market outcomes and induce responses from monetary, fiscal, and regulatory policymakers, they wrote. Theoretical models suggest that rising uncertainty can affect economic activity and decision-making in various ways. The authors explained, in particular, they noted firms may delay investment and hiring, households may reduce spending by increasing their savings rates if they anticipate possible changes in their income or wealth. Financing costs may rise if risk premiums increase, and even in your own testimony submitted to this committee, you noted that consumer spending has bounced back from a sluggish first quarter and is chugging along. And this uncertainty is exacerbated for consumers in Missouri when the president is gloating about how great the economy is, yet the Federal Reserve is considering a rate cut. How do you account for these mixed messages?
Well, I haven't seen that blog post, but I would strongly agree with the sense of it. We do think that uncertainty can cause businesses to hold back on investment and hiring. In fact, we've been hearing that in our FOMC-based discussions with businesses around the country. Household confidence has remained high, but over time, uncertainty can cause households to hold back as well. So I think that's a pretty standard finding.
What about the factor of savings? I mean, how does that play into?
Savings?
Yeah. Is that good or bad?
Sorry?
Is that good or bad for families to save?
Well, the savings rate has actually been fairly high lately, and that is a good, well, it's good for people to save what they think they need to save. And I think as a general thought, as a general fact, Americans need to save more for retirement than they have. They're not over-saving, they're under-saving in the aggregate. So it's a good thing.
Could they also be saving in anticipation of a calamity, of economic calamity occurring?
Well, yes. I was going to say that there's also, it's good to save, but at the same time, if there's a shock to confidence, you can see people pulling back from their regular consumption patterns, and that will show up in demand, and the economy will weaken.
Okay, as far as the decision-making on the part of the Fed, are you relying on conventional economic data or being swayed by jawboning of the president?
We see the economy as being in a good place, and we're committed to using our tools to keep it there. As we've discussed, the overall economy is performing reasonably well, but we see what we've called cross currents, principally trade developments and concerns over global growth. And we see those, and many FOMC participants at the last meeting saw those as weighing on the outlook and calling for possibly more accommodative policy.
Thank you for that response. And Chairman Powell, despite data proving that diverse companies perform more successfully, we still find that financial services industry is largely white and male at its highest level. What more can you do as chair to incentivize diversity and equity within the Federal Reserve System?
Thank you for that question. We put a very high value on diversity. I strongly believe that having diverse perspectives around the table leads you to better decisions. And I believe in having a culture where people are free to speak and will be heard. And that goes to all different dimensions of diversity. So we've made, I think, a lot of progress at the Fed. I think I would never say there isn't more to do. There's a lot more we can do. And I think we're very focused on that as an organization. I would say most of my career was in the private sector. I saw that really successful companies, one of the things they do well is they do diversity well, because that's how you get better results with diverse perspectives. So we're strongly committed to that.
Thank you, and my time's up. You're back.
Mr. Stivers, the gentleman from Ohio, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chairman Powell, I really appreciate you being here. I want to thank you for your transparency and accessibility as Fed Chair, and you've been available to all of us in our offices, in your office, and I appreciate that. This committee hearing is about monetary policy and the state of the economy, and I'll stay focused on those issues and leave the regulatory issues to when Vice Chair Quarles is here. And with regard to monetary policy, when I was in your office, I really appreciate you keeping the 100 million Venezuelan bolivars I gave you as you answered to your question, to the question on Japan. Once inflation starts rolling, it's really hard to get a control of, as the Venezuelans have found. And so the fact that you guys have a stable price target and are sticking to it, I think makes a huge difference. I know that there's a lot of potential shocks, including tariffs and other things that can impact that, but so far you guys have done a great job on monetary policy. And in your question, or another question about unemployment, and the tight labor markets, I think you talked about the fact that wages are starting to go up. It's starting to actually benefit people who've actually not benefited from this economic expansion over the last 10 years, which is a good thing. And I know some observers have been calling for a so-called hot monetary policy on the premise that further tightening of the labor market will benefit those demographics that have missed out on the expansion and drive up wages and make labor markets tight and help those folks. Can you comment on whether the members of the FMOC have talked about those views and what the potential risks and benefits associated with a hot monetary policy might be?
I guess I would start by saying that we don't have any basis, pardon me, or any evidence for calling this a hot labor market. Pardon me. We have wages moving up at a little above 3%, and that's good. It's good because it was more like 2% 5 years ago. But 3% barely covers productivity. It doesn't even really cover productivity increases and inflation. And it certainly isn't a high enough wage to put any upward pressure on inflation. And we haven't seen, as this long cycle has gone on, we haven't seen wages moving up as sharply as they have in the past. I do think it's very gratifying that for the last 2 years, the greater part of wage gains have gone to people at the lower end of the wage spectrum and education spectrum. That's a very positive thing. But 3.7% is a low unemployment rate, but to call something hot, you need to see some heat. And while we hear lots of reports of labor, of companies having a hard time finding qualified labor, nonetheless, we don't see wages really responding. So I don't really see that as a current issue.
Great. And, if we want to see wages continue to grow, we're going to need economic growth. And one of the things that this Congress has in front of it is the USMCA. I know a lot of the questions you're going to get are going to be about trade war with China, but can you comment about the importance of the USMCA and the North American investment that a lot of companies have made in a North American supply chain?
Pardon me, I wouldn't take a position on the details of the USMCA, though, but I will say that having it pass would remove a real bit of the uncertainty that is weighing on the outlook, and I think it would be quite a positive thing from that standpoint.
And I think that's what we all need to focus on is fighting the uncertainty, and there are things we can do with that. And I think as policymakers, we need to come together and do that. The last question, because I've only got a minute left, is on Libra and Facebook. If Facebook can't sufficiently answer your questions about anti-money laundering, know your customer, what would your message be to the banks that provide banking to Facebook, and what would your advice to Facebook be?
Well, I don't think that the project can go forward, and I just think it cannot go forward without there being broad satisfaction with the way the company has addressed money laundering, all of those things. There are a number of concerns that I listed at the beginning data protection, consumer privacy, all of those things will need to be addressed very thoroughly and carefully, and again, in a deliberate process that will not be a sprint to implementation.
And I want to echo your comments that we all want innovation, but we want innovation that protects data security and the know your customer, anti-money laundering laws that are so important to our economy. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Scott, the gentleman from Georgia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Chairman Powell. Good to see you again. First thing I want to say to you is I want you to stay strong, be courageous. It is important for this nation and the economy of the world that the Federal Reserve remain strongly independent. The other thing I want to say to you is have no fear. The president can't fire you. And we in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, got your back. Now, I want to go to what I think is, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, this Libra business is really disturbing, and it's a serious problem. And let me tell you why. First of all, I think we all know Libra is the London Interbank Offered Rate. Very critical. It has and is the standard for the base rate for hundreds of trillions of dollars, both overnight and term loans, debt, derivatives, and it is the standard that has been used internationally and extensively in the United States, affecting individuals, small businesses, large corporations. So we got a big issue here. But because of pervasive manipulation now, it is apparent that Libra is going to leave us or be removed within the next year or so. So this creates a big problem. And so I want to ask you, because the most critical part of this is that parties to both sides of the financial contracts should be and must be concerned in the short term about the potential ramifications of the end of Libra, specifically in contracts that do not have a fallback position. And as you know, without a fallback language or some appropriately established safe harbor until a new reference rate can be used, significant legal problems and challenges are likely to occur. So, with this in mind, as Libra's schedule end nears, and so far is the secured overnight financing rate apparently will take its place. Tell us, Chairman, what can we do? What can be done to accommodate the numerous contacts that do not have fallback positions?
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I think you said it very well. This is I think there are 300 trillion plus in contracts referencing LIBOR in 5 different currencies. And the manipulation was revealed really almost a decade ago, and I think the Financial Conduct Authority, which supervises the LIBOR banks, has said it will not compel the banks to submit LIBOR past the end of 2021, and LIBOR could then end. So we've spent many years now looking at ways to make sure that contracts do have fallbacks, and we're working with, we've worked with the retail groups in particular now for mortgages and things like that to find a way so that if LIBOR is not published, there will be a rate that is the fallback rate, and that has to be put into contracts in one way or another. It's a vast project. It's one that many people are working on and working hard to meet that deadline.
Yeah, and LIBOR will be gone. Am I right? Am my calculations right? Within the next year or so?
It's actually, I think, the end of 21. It won't necessarily be gone, but the banks will no longer be required to submit their their estimates of the of their interbank borrowing rates, and so it may go away, and I think we're requiring people to assume that it will, so that they'll be ready if it does.
Yeah, when you say ready for the dust, what
Ready if it does go away.
Oh, if it does go away.
Yes.
So if it does go away, what will the situation be like?
Well, ideally, this is the situation we're aiming for, is one in which people have either moved their obligations to SOFR, as you mentioned, secured overnight funding rate, or some other rate, or failing that, they have a rate in their contract where if LIBOR is no longer published, the other rate just seamlessly falls into place, and the two parties to the contract, the consumer and the bank, let's say, they know what the rate is, and they know that, so that's what we need to accomplish. And again, we're working hard on it.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Kustoff, the gentleman from Tennessee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for convening today's hearing, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for appearing today. If I could, I'd like to follow up on a line of questioning that Congressman Stivers had relating to the USMCA. If you could you, we're going to face the option of passing it or not passing it in this Congress. What is the effect to our economy if we do in fact pass the USMCA, and conversely, what is the effect to the economy if we fail to pass the USMCA?
I don't actually have a precise evaluation for you of what the effects of passage would be. Overall, it's pretty similar to NAFTA. So I would imagine that the longer term differences, the differences will show up over the longer term. I think the effects of not passing it would really depend on what happens to NAFTA. If NAFTA were then to be terminated, there could be quite a lot of uncertainty. And I think there is some uncertainty now about what's going to happen. I think the passage of it would remove that uncertainty, and that would be a good thing.
And it would also be positive for our farmers and our ag communities if USMCA were passed.
Yes, I think it would.
Do you have an opinion how the passage or the non-passage of the USMCA affects our leverage with China in negotiations and trade negotiations?
I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on those negotiations, and I don't really have an answer for you on that.
In the next several weeks, purportedly, we're going to be voting on a proposal to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. There was a CBO report that came out in the last day or so that estimated that a raise in the minimum wage to $15 an hour should cut 1.3 million jobs up to 3.7 million jobs. What would the effect be to the economy if Congress were to pass a minimum wage bill of raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour?
The question of the minimum wage is really one for you. I think there are a range of studies that have different outcomes, but like the CBO study, what they tend to show is that a number of people get higher wages and a number of people lose their jobs. And those numbers will change depending on what assumptions you make. And it really is something that there is no consensus among economists. Economists are all over the place on this. So it's really a question for you to sort of look at. I would look at a range of studies and not take any single one, and I would weigh that and say, are the benefits worth the likely costs?
What is the effect to the economy if 1.3 million people lose their jobs, or 3.7 million people lose their jobs as a result of the rise in minimum wage to $15 an hour?
Well, it would depend on, again, there would be costs and benefits. We know that some people would get higher wages, and presumably they'd be better off and they'd spend more. So it's not a judgment that we make on net. It's a judgment that you have to make, that there'll be people who are made better off by it, and those are all the people who have the higher minimum wage, but there will be a number of people who lose their jobs because that's what will happen, I think, empirically.
Would the Federal Reserve be concerned if 1.3 million people to 3.7 million people lost their jobs because minimum wage was raised to $15 an hour?
Again, Mr. Kustoff, we do not take a position. We never have taken a position on the minimum wage, and we would take whatever decision you make as the decision that we would put into our models, and we would just take it as a given. We wouldn't express either support or disapproval.
When I'm back home in West Tennessee, what I hear generally from employers, small, medium, and large, the economy's good, we're making money, we're making more money than we made in 20 or 30 years. We can't find enough employees, we can't find employees with soft skills, we can't find employees who have the skills we need for the jobs, we can't find employees who can pass a drug test. Specifically, and you've talked about this publicly, the effect of the opioid crisis on the workforce. What is your feeling with that, and how does the opioid crisis affect the workforce?
An extraordinary number of people are taking opioids in one form or another, and it weighs on labor force participation, largely but not exclusively on younger males, also younger women. And it's a national crisis, really. And I mean, there's the humanitarian aspect of it is completely compelling, but the economic impact is also quite substantial.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, good to see you. Thanks for your testimony today. Let me just start with some questions that Mr. Scott was asking on Libra. Given sort of the uncertainties and the ability to kind of manage this new currency, if you will, I mean, would the Federal Reserve, would you support some postponement in their implementing Libra, or any kind of a moratorium until we got to have a better understanding of the impact really on our economy and our ability to manage money?
You know, I think that there are deep, important, serious questions across a range of issues here that will need to be addressed, and the process of doing that is going to have to be patient and thorough and not a sprint, and that's what I would say. So I do think there's a lot of work going on at the Fed and at other agencies, and I think in the government to understand these issues. I think it's something that doesn't fit neatly or easily within our regulatory scheme. It does have potentially systemic scale, and for all the reasons we've discussed, it needs a careful look. And so I strongly believe we need to all be taking our time here.
I'm going to take that as a yes. Thank you. Now I got a couple other questions, and I don't know if you have your booklet in front of you, but I always like the graphs that you folks prepare because they're very informative, and especially graph 2 in my district in Colorado. So graph 2 is really the unemployment rate, and the fact that for about 9-10 years now there's been a steady decrease in unemployment. In my district in Colorado, we've enjoyed under 3% for about 7 years running, which is pretty remarkable. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Federal Reserve for the role you've been playing there. But one of your answers really, I think, is important to what we face as members of Congress, is the fact that for most Americans, their wages still, they're struggling, month to month, year to year, to get ahead, to really be able to deal with the costs that we all see. So in your predictions, in what the Federal Reserve's doing, do you see improvement in what everyday Americans are making and sort of catching up and getting ahead where they lost a ton through the recession and the years right after that?
So what we're hearing, we're hearing this quite a lot from people who work and live in low and moderate income communities, is that there really hasn't been a recovery for these people until recently. But now they are feeling, with this tight labor market, they are feeling employers who are waiving, issues that might have prevented people from being in the workforce. They're willing to look past those. They're recruiting people who have been outside the labor force. In fact, we've had people say to us that this is really the best feel that they've had for many years, if ever. And all of that really, in my thinking and our thinking, just says how important it is for us to continue to sustain this expansion. This has really come together just in the last, we've had a long, as you can see from that chart, the labor market has improved steadily for 10 years now, but just in the last couple of years, it started to reach communities at the edge of the workforce, and it's just so important for us to continue that process for a couple of years, and that's why we're so committed to using our tools to sustain the expansion.
Thank you. My last question, the only graph that I saw that really is kind of perplexing and problematic is on page 31 of your of the monetary policy report, and that's the one on trade policy uncertainty. And if there's a place that I think we as members of Congress are concerned, and I think both Democrats and Republicans, it is on trade policy. And this graph, if I read it correctly, shows that it isn't just members of Congress that are concerned about the president's trade policy, it's the people that you survey. I mean, can you tell me what that graph says?
Well, it shows trade policy as quite elevated, and I think we know that. In our beige book, we report discussions from around the country, from all kinds of business and community folks, and I think trade policy has been elevated. And it's been particularly elevated since May, by the way. It's spiked in May with those developments, and there's no question it's elevated.
All right. Thank you for your testimony, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Hollingsworth, the gentleman from Indiana, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I really appreciate you being here. Good morning, rather. I can tell time. Does not bode well for my questions, huh? So I wanted to talk a little bit about your use of the word throughout testimony and the written testimony, symmetrical, around 2%, right? And I think you, in your opening statements, referred to total PCE for the trailing 12 months at 1.5%, core 1.6%. What do you mean by symmetry around 2%? What does symmetry mean to you?
So in our longer run statement of longer run policy goals and monetary policy strategy, we define symmetry to mean that the committee would be concerned if inflation were to run persistently above or below 2%. So it's really a symmetry of concern or of intention as opposed to outcome.
Right. And so over the last 10 years, right, it's run persistently below 2%. Does that imply a willingness or acceptability for inflation to run for a period of time moderately or slightly above 2%, given some of the disinflationary pressures from around the world?
So under our current framework, all it says is that if inflation is above 2% or below 2%, we would look at that symmetrically and we would use our tools to guide it back
to 2%.
To 2%.
Right.
So, and of course, a central question we're asking as part of our monetary policy review is whether that's the right way to think about it, when in fact all of the deviations from 2% have been below, not above.
Right.
And so inflation has been averaging less than 2%. Right.
It's unmistakable when you look around the world, right? There's a lot of traps associated with very low inflation and how persistent that seems to be around the world. I know that's some concern that you've expressed as well on many occasions, that we don't want to get mired in very low inflation. We want to have stable prices, but stable around that 2%. As you think about where the economy is today, think about where inflationary pressures are today, is there a desire to ensure we don't fall into the same trap by pushing the economy faster, being more accommodating in monetary policy to push that 2%, as you said, if it's symmetrical, to push inflation to that 2%?
Well,
through the indirect means that you have available to you.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, through the indirect means that you have available to you to manage inflation expectations going forward.
I think we want inflation to be symmetrically at 2%. And not at 1.7 or 1.8%, because that will ultimately, lower inflation will ultimately work its way into expectations and into short-term interest rates.
Right.
And that'll mean we have less, and plus, so we really do want to have inflation symmetrically at 2%.
Right. And so one of the things that you've talked about is people's expectations for future inflation, which have been very much anchored by their recent history with inflation, right? That recent history over the past 10 years has been below 2% inflation. And in order to move people's expectations going forward, they need to experience slightly faster paces of inflation. I think most research continues to indicate that recent experience informs expectations going forward. So I just wanted to come back to and better understand what you were saying around that symmetrical. Like the goal is to push inflation up to 2% or have a willingness or tolerance up to 2%, and if it should run above 2% to be able to bring it back down to 2%. Is that what you mean by?
Well, I want to draw a distinction between our current framework is the one I described for you, where we would always be pushing back for 2%. We're looking at different ways to, and that, by the way, that framework seems to have achieved errors on one side, which are consistent with the framework.
Correct.
And we're asking the question whether that's the right way to keep doing it, or whether we should be looking at something which produces more symmetric outcomes. We haven't made that decision.
Right.
That's one of the fundamental things we're looking at as part of this.
And one of the dialogues I know that we've had in the past, and I certainly want to continue, especially publicly, to encourage you to continue that research and developing that framework. I think it is really important, given all the pressures that we see around the world and some of the other developed countries that have fallen into this very low, persistent low inflation, that we should really think about how we continue to manage what we're doing in monetary policy and reflecting those concerns. And so I appreciate the work that you're doing. One last question. What have we learned over the past 10 years about the limits of monetary policy, and how do those limits inform what you believe the next steps might be with regard to monetary policy? Well, if you can answer that broad question in 12 seconds.
I will. I would say it's not a good thing to have monetary policy being the main game in town, let alone the only game in town. Mm-hmm. Fiscal policy is very powerful and more powerful, and it's there come times, for example, after the financial crisis, where you need fiscal policy to really lift the economy.
Right.
So it's not a good thing to have monetary policy be responsible exclusively for things, and it shouldn't be. And
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for your great work.
Mr. Himes, the gentleman from Connecticut, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here. Good morning. Thank you for your testimony. I've got two questions, one on monetary policy, one on the broader regulatory environment around the banks. Let's start with just a couple of minutes, though. Let's wake up the room with a discussion of interest paid on excess reserves. The Fed's policy obviously changed pretty dramatically in 2008. If the numbers I'm reading are correct, excess reserves today are in the neighborhood of $1.5 trillion. I have a couple of sort of intuitive, at least, concerns with that. That obviously has a pretty dramatic effect on liquidity in the system. It creates a business model for banks, obviously, who can essentially get risk-free money from the Fed in a way that is not available to my constituents. But I suppose what really concerns me in the context of monetary policy, I'm sure you're aware of a report that was published by the Minneapolis Fed in which the individual who wrote it, and I'll just quote the report, what potentially matters about high excess reserves is that they provide a means by which decisions made by banks, not those made by the monetary authority, could increase inflation-inducing liquidity dramatically and quickly. So my question is, at a minimum, if that is true, that could be a significant impairment of the FOMC's ability to actually control monetary policy. So my question is, what is the future of the policy with respect to interest paid on excess reserves?
I'm not familiar with that paper from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, but as I'm sure you're aware, during the financial crisis, we bought a lot of assets, and the offsetting liability, the way we paid for it is by issuing reserves. At the same time, we vastly increased the required liquidity that largest financial institutions have to hold, vastly increased that, and many of them choose to hold reserves. So demand for reserves, even after the balance sheet shrinks, is so much higher. And we're actually trying to find what that demand is, and it might be somewhere a bit below the current range that it's in.
But sir, the demand obviously is to some extent driven by the rate that is paid on those reserves. You control the demand for reserves above and beyond required reserves.
To some extent we do, though, but banks choose to hold, they have to hold a certain quantity. They could also hold treasuries, but they like reserves because they're highly liquid, and it's not, they pay the same as treasuries, by the way, roughly the same. So in terms of IOER, though, the thing is, in our framework, in our chosen framework for conducting monetary policy, IOER is the critical rate. It's how we manage, it's the administered rate, that's how we manage monetary policy. We've been doing that for really 10 years from now, and we've decided earlier this year that we would remain in that system. Getting to a system where you, instead of using an administered rate, you manage the quantity of reserves on the edge of scarcity and set the price that way, which is what we did, would be very, very tough given the level of demand for reserves.
So should we, I mean, as you know, there was a fairly dramatic policy shift in 2008. Some have said that the amount of interest paid on excess reserves was well in excess of what Congress envisioned in the time and in the legislation of 2006. Is this now a status quo monetary policy tool that the Congress should anticipate works in conjunction with your control of other rates?
Absolutely. This is our principal tool for implementing monetary policy, is interest on excess reserves.
Okay. Let me shift, just because time is short, to a broader regulatory question. We have heard from CEOs of banks, we've heard from the Vice Chairman and others that, generally speaking, the banking system is safe and sound, well capitalized. When the CEOs of the large banks were in front of this committee a couple of months ago, they identified two things with some consistency as being of concern. One was leveraged lending, which is a bit odd because most leveraged loans get put into CLOs, which then get taken outside of the banking system. But interestingly, they also said shadow banking. Now, by definition, you don't have a lot of control over shadow banking. But given the consistency of that, given the fact that an awful lot of the risk from leveraged lending, which they identified as risky, concerning, I should say, not risky, concerning, how are you thinking about potential risk bubbling up in the broader shadow banking system?
We, well, and particularly on leveraged lending, we've called out the risk. The risk is not so much located in the banks. It's located, as you know, in CLOs, mutual funds, hedge funds, insurance companies, and all those things. So, and it's not subject, those vehicles are not subject to runs in the same way that pre-crisis banks were and really no longer are. So the systemic risk question is not a prominent one. It's more a macroeconomic question. So if the corporate sector gets very highly levered, then in the event of a downturn, you will see companies that have to lay off workers and stop spending and that kind of thing. So it could be a macroeconomic multiplier. You know, this is a project that the Financial Stability Oversight Council is working on now, and also the Financial Stability Board globally is looking carefully at leveraged lending, and you know, we think it's something that requires serious monitoring.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gonzalez, the gentleman from Ohio, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here today. First, I want to thank you on your transparency and all the data that you provide. I think you know, there's a sense that some of these decisions may be made behind closed doors, but I think when you're transparent and open about what the data is that you're looking at, I think that helps. It certainly helps me to understand. I want to kind of summarize two things that you've talked about with respect to all the data you're looking at currently in interest rate policy. And if I think I'm understanding you correctly, I'm hearing that trade uncertainty and persistent low inflation short of our 2% target are kind of the two biggest bogeys for you, so to speak. Am I summarizing that correctly?
That's
based
fair.
on the current situation? Okay. I think we did a nice job covering the importance of passing USMCA to help from a certainty standpoint. You didn't weigh in on the deal itself, but it certainly makes things more secure or more certain. On the inflation side, it seems to me that in a world where we're still short of our target and we have trade uncertainty, and those are the two biggest factors you're considering, that raising rates would certainly be irresponsible. I would argue for lowering them, but would it be fair to characterize, based on what we're seeing on those two factors specifically, that a strong case could be made for lowering, and not to commit you to that, but is that sort of where things seem to be headed?
So yes, as I mentioned, we think that uncertainty around trade policy and also global growth, it's not all down to trade policy. There's something going on with growth around the world, particularly around manufacturing and investment and trade. And so that uncertainty is we think, weighing on the domestic economy. It's starting to show up a little bit, we think, in business sentiment readings, which have moved down, and also in weaker business fixed investment. And then, as you pointed out, the other piece of it is inflation. We see the risk of a more prolonged shortfall of inflation from our target. That's not something we desire. It's something we want to avoid.
It would encourage a more accommodative policy.
And those things do, many on the committee see those things as strengthening the case for a somewhat more accommodative policy.
Thank you. And then I want to shift to the balance sheet a little bit. We haven't really talked about that. So in January, you announced a major shift. I thought it was a major shift in terms of how we were going to manage the rate going forward, which is to shift towards administered rates. We're going to pause the drawdown of the balance sheet. Can you kind of walk me through the logic on that a little bit? My concern here is, are we going to still be prepared to handle another financial crisis if that sort of thing were to happen while we have an expanded balance sheet? And in the long run, do you see us moving more towards going back towards open market operations, which historically has been how we did this?
So actually, since the QE era began, reserves have been super abundant, and we haven't set monetary policy really by,
right.
We took monetary policy to zero, and it couldn't go any lower, and so we didn't have to have scarce reserves. We only had to have scarce reserves when we lifted off in December of 2015, and we didn't, so we used the administered rates, which is IOER. So we've been using them for a long time. It wasn't really a change. What was new, you're right about this, what was new is after having thought about it really for years, we decided after much deliberation that this would be our permanent framework. We think it works well. We think it has a lot of benefits. In terms of room for further quantitative easing, that is just as what we'd be buying would be Treasury securities, and the manufacturers are busy, as I understand it. There's plenty of them out there, and there would be no shortage of them to buy. There are questions about the efficacy, and there's a lot of research that's gone on how much quantitative easing affects interest rates and thereby the economy. But I don't see the size of our balance sheet as limiting our ability to buy more, just as a practical matter.
Okay, thanks. And then with my last sort of question, when you look at Libra specifically, I see it as three different things. I see it as Libra, which is a currency, Calibra, which is the wallet. They seem to desire to be a bank, and then the Libra Association itself. As we're evaluating how to approach this, one, are those the three buckets that we should be looking at? And two, what gives you the biggest concern? As you sort of said, let's pause it broadly. And maybe I'm running out of time, so we'll submit this in written questions. But any feedback you have on that will be greatly appreciated by this committee. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Lawson, the gentleman from Florida, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Powell, welcome to the committee. Could you elaborate, and you might have, how did the top 1% of U.S. families own 40% of the wealth in this country? How did we get to that particular point? Do you see any kind of banners coming in the future? The top 1% own 40% of the wealth in America. We say we are a very rich country compared to other countries, but how did we get to the point where 1% own 40% of the wealth in this country?
What I've seen and what I mentioned in my testimony that's troubling is that a couple of things. First, median incomes and lower incomes have stagnated compared to those at the high end. So there was a time not so long ago when there's always a disparity between the wealthiest and the least, but it was nowhere near this large. So what's happened is those people in the middle and at the lower end of the wage and wealth spectrum have seen their wealth and wages move up, but much less than those at the top. And that's troubling. The other thing that's troubling, sort of a separate issue, is lack of mobility. So the chances of being born, if you're born in the bottom 20% of wealth or of anything, you can calculate what are the chances empirically that you'll move into the middle quintile or the top quintile. And they're actually lower in the United States than they are in many other similar advanced economy democracies. So these are troubling things. I would personally put them down to a combination of technology, globalization, and education, really. It comes down to the education system needs to produce people who can take advantage of advancing technology and globalization. And what you've seen is a stagnation in educational attainment in the United States relative to other countries beginning about 40 years ago. And that has been, I think, an underlying force that's driving this phenomenon.
Okay, another question is, recently in June, let's say in Ontario, in Canada, minimum wage went to around $13 and let's say 25 cents an hour. And earlier you stated that our minimum wage at the federal level is around $7 and maybe 25 cents. It hadn't been changed since maybe 2009 or something of this nature. And in your testimony, you said that it's up to Congress to really make that happen. And there's been a lot of discussion on what's going to happen to businesses and so forth. The reason why I say that is in 2020 in Ontario, Canada, they'll go to $15 plus per hour for the economy. Do you see, and you talked about before, by a gradual increase in the minimum wage in this country, it's going to affect businesses to the point that they'll be closing? Because what you see mostly at the end of the year is a lot of these businesses have a very big surplus to invest or pay taxes on. And so what is the difference in passing those increases to their employees instead of giving it back to the federal government or giving the money to some charity? How do you weigh in any on the minimum wage increase as far as the stability of the economy?
We don't really take a position on minimum wage, and the reason is, there's a lot of research and it shows costs and benefits. It tends to show costs and benefits depending on what you assume and how fast you move. I think how quickly they move up is an important indicator. But when you raise the minimum wage, some people lose their jobs and some people benefit. They get higher wages. And so I think you can look at a range of studies and they'll come up with, as many different economists as study this will have different answers. And you can weigh that, and that's a trade-off that you make. We have never taken a position on minimum wage. It's the classic thing for a legislature to do and not for us to do.
All right, one quick question. Do you ever look at the way credit card companies increase their interest and finance charges compared to the way the economy is going? Credit card companies.
The way credit card companies, do what?
Increase their finance charges compared to the way the economy is going. You know, like the economy is stable right now, but interest rate, and I know I got to close, some of the credit card companies are 28, 29% and so forth. I might have to send you some information on that.
I would be happy to follow up on that with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lawson.
Thank you. Mr. Rose, the gentleman from Tennessee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being with us today, Chairman Powell. I am a vocal advocate for putting our federal government on a more sustainable fiscal path. Our federal debt now stands at $22 trillion, more than $22 trillion. Interest on that debt is a big federal spending item amounting to about $360 billion last year. That was approximately 8% of all federal spending. Interest on the debt is becoming the fastest rising element of our federal budget. Our net interest expense could increase substantially if and when interest rates eventually return to more historically typical levels. It seems possible that we might even soon spend more on interest than on our national defense, because we have to in order to service our debt. The President's own budget from 2018 forecasted that net interest expense will exceed defense discretionary spending by 2026. It looks like the federal deficit this year will exceed $1 trillion, as it will in the next several years after that, based on current predictions. It is hard to see how the federal government can issue that much new debt without further driving up interest rates. One of your predecessors once said, there is no question that as deficits go up, it does affect long-term interest rates. He continued, "A rise in the debt increases the amount of interest expenses, which in turn increases the debt still further, and there is an accelerating pattern after you reach a certain point of no return." Could you talk with us today a bit about some of the potential risk to financial stability posed by our current fiscal path, and in particular, current federal spending?
I think the United States federal budget is on an unsustainable path in the sense that spending is growing faster than the economy, and ultimately that becomes unsustainable at some point. I think we're racking up greater and greater debt. I start to say the debt is growing faster than the economy. Debt as a percentage of GDP is going up, and that is unsustainable, I meant to say. It's something that we need to get back to and assess, and it's not up to us to say how to do that, what combination of spending and taxes. That is, of course, totally the province of the legislature. But it's something that's important over the longer run. And what will happen if we don't do it is that we'll wind up spending more and more on interest and less on the things that we really need to spend money on, educating our grandchildren and all of the important things that we do for the benefit of the public with federal tax dollars.
What are your views about the Federal Reserve's role in monitoring financial stability risk posed by the deficits?
We do have a broad role in monitoring financial stability. I would say, the four key pillars we look at are leverage in the financial system, leverage away from the banks, funding risk, and asset prices. We don't really think of longer-run fiscal unsustainability as a financial stability risk. It's more of a, we're the world's reserve currency. We keep being able to borrow. My predecessor, who predicted that more debt would lead to higher interest rates, would be surprised to see that with the debt that we have, we still borrow at very low interest rates because we are the world's reserve currency. So we haven't seen higher rates, but to the extent we go on raising debt to GDP, we'll just wind up spending more and more money on interest and less on the things we need.
If you will, talk about the impact of higher interest rates, if in fact deficits lead to higher interest rates, on the stability of the financial system in the aggregate.
Well, I think down the road at some point, rates, ultimately there's a price to pay here in higher rates. That has to be true at some point, although Japan has far higher debt to GDP than we do and pays even lower interest rates. So it's hard to say, but ultimately I think the debt that we're racking up is really going for essentially current consumption, and we're passing the bills on to future generations. And I think our generation's entitled to spend whatever money we think we need for ourselves during our lifetimes, but we really ought to pay for it. We ought to be paying for it rather than passing the bills along to the next generation.
And finally, in 3 seconds, is there a point of no return?
Somewhere way out in the future. There has to be, I think, in principle.
I yield back.